You can now take a hike in the water of beautiful Lake Tahoe. California state parks have developed Tahoe's first.
The water dropped, and what it revealed had been sitting at the bottom of one of America's most visited lakes for longer than anyone was prepared to admit. A dive team went down expecting sediment, debris, maybe some lost fishing equipment. What they found instead stopped the lead diver mid-descent. She hovered there 60 feet below the surface, staring at something that should not exist. When she surfaced, she did not speak for several minutes. What she eventually said would quietly unravel decades of assumptions about Lake Tahoe. Hi, my name is Justine, and this is Uncovered Expedition, the lake that hides everything. There are lakes, and then there is Lake Tahoe. Most people know it as the jewel of the Sierra Nevada. The impossibly blue water stretched across the California-Nevada border that draws millions of tourists every year. The place where you take photographs that nobody believes are real because the water looks too blue, too clear, too perfect to be natural. People assume it has been digitally enhanced. It is not. That color is real, and the reason for it is part of what makes this lake so deeply unusual. Lake Tahoe sits at an elevation of 6,225 feet above sea level. It is approximately 22 miles long and 12 miles wide. Those numbers sound impressive until you get to the one that really matters. The lake is 1,645 feet deep at its maximum depth. That makes it the second deepest lake in the United States and the 16th deepest lake on Earth. Think about what that means for a moment. The surface of Lake Tahoe sits more than a mile above sea level, and the bottom of the lake sits nearly 1,000 feet below sea level. You're looking at a body of water that punches through the Earth's surface in a way that feels almost geological aggressive. The clarity of the water is not just beautiful, it is scientifically extraordinary. In the 1960s, researchers measured visibility in Lake Tahoe at approximately 100 feet. You could drop something the size of a dinner plate and watch it disappear from view 100 feet below you. That is not a lake. That is more like floating above an underwater sky. That clarity has declined significantly since then, and we will get to why. But even now, Lake Tahoe's transparency exceeds almost every other freshwater lake in the world. Here is what most tourists do not know. That stunning clarity, that gorgeous depth, that postcard perfection comes with a deeply unsettling trade-off. Lake Tahoe almost never gives up what it takes. The water is cold, genuinely dangerously cold. Surface temperatures vary seasonally, but at depth the lake maintains a temperature of around the 39 degrees Fahrenheit year-round. That is just above freezing. And cold water does something specific to human bodies. It preserves them. In warm lakes and rivers, decomposition happens relatively quickly. Gases build up inside a body, providing buoyancy and eventually remains surface. Lake Tahoe does not work that way. The cold slows decomposition to a crawl. Bodies that sink in Lake Tahoe tend to stay exactly where they land. Perfectly preserved, perfectly hidden. In water so deep that recovery is practically impossible. Local divers have known this for generations. There are stories passed between the diving community in hushed, careful tones about what you encounter at depth in this lake. Things that have been sitting undisturbed in the cold dark for decades. Some of them are objects. Some of them are not. But the lake was hiding something else. Something far older than any of that. Something that required the water level itself to drop before anyone could even begin to understand the scale of what was down there. The drop. Nobody could explain. Water levels in mountain lakes fluctuate. This is not unusual. Snowpack, rainfall, evaporation, temperature cycles, these all contribute to natural variation in how much water a lake holds at any given time. Scientists monitor these changes. Hydrologists track them. And for a lake as closely watched as Tahoe, the data goes back well over a century, which is exactly why what started happening around 2019 alarmed researchers who were paying attention. The water level at Lake Tahoe began dropping at a rate that exceeded normal seasonal variation. Not dramatically, not catastrophically, but persistently, measurably, in ways that did not align with the models that had accurately predicted lake behavior for decades. By 2021, The lake had dropped to its lowest recorded level in decades, and then it kept dropping. Now here's where the official explanation gets interesting, because there was one, and it was delivered promptly, confidently, and with the kind of institutional certainty that should always make you slightly suspicious. The California-Nevada drought, a documented and genuine crisis, was cited as the primary driver. Less precipitation, higher evaporation rates, reduced snowpack in the Sierra Nevada, feeding less meltwater into the lake's tributaries. The math worked on paper, and they were not wrong exactly. The drought absolutely contributed. But several hydrologists who study the Tahoe Basin specifically noted something that did not fit neatly into the drought narrative. The rate of decline was not uniform across the drainage basin. Certain areas of the lake bed were being exposed at a rate that suggested the loss was coming not just from the surface through evaporation, but potentially from below through seepage. Lake Tahoe sits on a geologically active fault system. The Lake Tahoe Basin is bounded by normal faults, the kinds of faults associated with the basin and range province that stretches across the American West. The lake itself exists because of ancient fault activity that dropped the basin floor while surrounding mountain blocks were lifted. Geologically speaking, Lake Tahoe is not just a lake, it is a wound in the earth that filled with water. Some researchers began asking questions that the official drought explanation did not address. Was increased seismic activity along the basin faults affecting water retention? Were there changes in the permeability of the lake bed itself? And critically, as shorelines receded and previously submerged areas became accessible, what was being revealed along the lake margins that had not been visible in living memory? That last question is the one that sent the dive teams in. I want to be clear here. Some of what followed happened gradually, documented by multiple independent researchers over several years. This is not the story of one dramatic moment. It is the story of evidence accumulating piece by piece until the picture it formed was impossible to ignore, and considerably more disturbing than the drought alone. The dive that changed everything. In the summer of 2022, a team of scientific divers affiliated with the University of California began a systematic survey of newly exposed and recently submerged shoreline areas along the lake's northwestern margin. The official purpose of the survey was environmental assessment. As water levels dropped, previously submerged sediment was being exposed to air and sun for the first time in decades, sometimes for the first time ever. The researchers wanted to document changes to the benthic ecosystem, the community of organisms living at and near the lakebed. Standard stuff, scientifically important, unlikely to make headlines. They were not looking for anything unusual. The lead diver on the initial survey was a researcher named Dr. Sarah Ortega, a freshwater ecologist with 12 years of experience diving in high-altitude lakes across the American West. She has since spoken publicly about what happened, though her accounts have been careful, measured, and somewhat frustrating to read if you are hoping for dramatic declarations. Above all, scientists are trained to be cautious. Sometimes that caution is appropriate. Sometimes it is a way of not saying out loud what you are clearly thinking. On the third day of the survey, diving in approximately 50 to 80 feet of water along a shelf that had been partially exposed by the receding shoreline, Ortega and her diving partner encountered something that was not in any ecological survey they had planned for. Structures, not natural rock formations, though the lake has plenty of those. Not collapsed timber from 19th century logging operations, though those exist too, scattered across parts of the lake bed like underwater ghost forests. Not debris from any known human activity on or near the water. What they found were arrangements of large stones, some weighing what Ortega estimated at several tons, positioned in patterns that were too consistent, too regular, and too deliberately oriented to be geological. Ortega described them in her initial field notes, which have since been referenced in an academic paper as rectilinear. That word matters. Rectilinear means characterized by straight lines and right angles. Nature does not do right angles. Erosion, glaciation, seismic activity, volcanic deposition, none of these processes reliably produce right angles in stone. Human beings produce right angles, or something behaving with the same intentionality as human beings. The formations extended along this submerged shelf for what the team estimated was several hundred feet. They had clearly been more extensive at some point. Many of the stones had shifted, tumbled, scattered over whatever event or slow process had broken the original arrangement. But enough remained in position to make the pattern unmistakable to anyone who spent time looking at it. I will be honest with you. When I first read through the original field notes, I assumed this was going to resolve cleanly into something mundane. Old mining infrastructure, a collapsed dock, some forgotten 19th century construction project sliding into the lake over 100 years. I was looking for the boring explanation, because boring explanations are usually correct. The boring explanation did not survive contact with the dating results. The official explanation, and why it falls apart. When Ortega's team reported their findings through official channels, the initial institutional response was, let us say, carefully underwhelming. The California Department of Water Resources, which monitors the lake, acknowledged the discovery and noted that receding water levels had exposed various geological and historical features along the shoreline. A spokesperson pointed to the long history of human activity around Lake Tahoe, including the Washoe people who had inhabited the region for thousands of years, and noted that evidence of shoreline use by indigenous communities was not unexpected, and again, not wrong exactly. The Washoe people's deep connection to Lake Tahoe is documented and important. They called the lake Da'au-Agie, meaning edge of the lake, and their history in the basin stretches back thousands of years. Archaeological evidence of their presence exists throughout the region, but here is where the official framing started to develop cracks. The stone formations found by Ortega's team were not in a location consistent with shoreline habitation. They were not on the ancient shore. They were well below it, in water depths that would have required the lake level to have been dramatically lower than at any point in recorded history, for those structures to have been built above the waterline. When geologists examined the position of the formations relative to known historical water levels, they encountered a timeline problem that the routine archaeological explanation could not resolve. For those structures to have been built by people standing on dry ground, the lake level would need to have been somewhere between 100 and 150 feet lower than it is today. That is not a minor fluctuation. That is not drought variation or seasonal change. A drop of that magnitude represents a fundamentally different lake in a fundamentally different climate period at a point in time that the conventional archaeological narrative for the region did not account for. Geologists know that lake levels in the Great Basin and Sierra Nevada region have varied enormously over geological timescales. During the last glacial maximum roughly 20,000 years ago, and during subsequent periods of dramatic climate shift, lake levels across the western United States were radically different from today. Lakes that are modest in size today were once enormous. Lakes that exist today were sometimes dry basins, and dry basins were sometimes full lakes. The dating question was suddenly not a minor academic footnote. It was the entire story. What the geology actually reveals here is where this gets genuinely unsettling. And I want to walk through this carefully because the implications deserve to be taken seriously rather than sensationalized. Geological surveys of the Lake Tahoe Basin conducted over the past 3 decades have established a detailed picture of the lake's history. Core samples taken from the lake bed contain layered sediment records going back tens of thousands of years. Changes in pollen and microscopic organisms in mineral composition tell scientists about past climates, past water levels, past ecological conditions. Those records show something remarkable. Approximately 13,000 to 14,000 years ago, at the end of the last glacial period, Lake Tahoe went through a period of dramatic fluctuation. As the glaciers that had covered the Sierra Nevada retreated, massive pulses of meltwater flooded into the basin. Then, as the climate shifted and the ice sources disappeared, input declined and the lake dropped. Researchers have identified paleo shorelines, ancient shorelines, now either above or below the current water level, that mark where the lake surface sat during these earlier periods. Some of these ancient shorelines are now exposed on hillsides above the lake. Others are submerged. The depth at which Ortega's team found the stone formations corresponds remarkably closely with a paleo shoreline identified in geological surveys as dating to approximately 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. Pause on that. 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. That is not the Washoe people building fishing platforms in the 19th century. That is not colonial era infrastructure. That is the Holocene, the early post-glacial period when human beings were present in North America, but when the entire landscape of the western continent looked radically different from today. Archaeological consensus has long held that early human presence in the Great Basin region was nomadic, sparse, and technologically limited. Hunter-gatherer groups following megafauna across a landscape still recovering from glaciation. People capable of sophisticated hunting strategies and tool use, but not of the organized labor and planning required to position multi-ton stones in deliberate rectilinear arrangements. That consensus is now under serious pressure from multiple directions simultaneously, and Lake Tahoe just became one of the pressure points. When researchers ran photogrammetric analysis on underwater photographs of the formations, the results deepened the mystery. The stones showed evidence of working, deliberate shaping on contact surfaces that increased stability in the assembled positions, not crude piling of convenient rocks. Stones that had been modified to fit together. The tool marks on those modified surfaces did not match any documented Paleo-Indian lithic technology from the region. They showed a controlled, repetitive working pattern more consistent with dedicated stone shaping tools than with the expedient flaking and percussion techniques characteristic of the archaeological record for this period and place. Someone built these structures, someone who knew what they were doing. The bodies. I promised I would come back to the bodies, and here we are. You probably thought I forgot. I did not forget. Lake Tahoe's reputation for preserving human remains is not folklore. It is documented, grim, and directly relevant to what the dive teams encountered during extended surveys of these submerged formations. The lake has claimed lives throughout recorded history. Boating accidents, drownings, and during the 19th and early 20th centuries, when the region was home to a rougher economy of mining, logging, and early organized crime, a number of people almost certainly ended up in the lake via methods that were not accidental. Jacques Cousteau, the legendary French oceanographer who needs no introduction, reportedly dove in Lake Tahoe in the 1970s. Various accounts claim that what he found at depth disturbed him profoundly. The specific story that circulates most widely is that Cousteau surfaced from a deep dive and refused to describe what he had seen, allegedly stating that the world was not ready for what was down there. Now, I have spent considerable time trying to verify this story, and I want to be honest with you about what I found. The Cousteau dive at Tahoe appears to be real. The quote attributed to him is impossible to confirm, and may be entirely apocryphal. I am not going to present it as documented fact because that is not what this channel does. What I will tell you is that the story persists with remarkable durability in the diving community, and that the conditions in the lake that would make such a discovery plausible are thoroughly documented. What the extended survey teams did find in the vicinity of the stone formations was not bodies in the sensational sense. What they found were bone fragments, scattered old, heavily degraded, even in the cold water, but bone fragments nonetheless. And when samples were sent for analysis, the preliminary results indicated they were not modern. They were not 19th century. The collagen degradation patterns suggested something considerably older. Old bones near old structures had a depth consistent with the paleo shoreline from 10,000 to 12,000 years ago. The pieces were assembling themselves into a picture that nobody on the survey team had anticipated standing in front of. The cover. Nobody talks about. I want to be precise here because this section is where the story most easily tips into territory I do not want to go. I'm not going to tell you there is a vast government conspiracy to hide the true history of Lake Tahoe. I do not believe that, and the evidence does not support it. What I will tell you is that there is a documented pattern of institutional reluctance around this discovery that raises legitimate questions about how findings like this get processed or fail to get processed through official channels. Dr. Ortega's initial report was submitted in the autumn of 2022. By the end of 2023, it had not been published. By mid-2024, a version appeared in a regional geology journal, notable for what it did not include relative to the original field notes that had been shared informally with other researchers. The bone fragment analysis was not mentioned. The rectilinear stone formations were described in language so carefully hedged as to be nearly unrecognizable. A geologist who reviewed both the original notes and the published paper, and who asked not to be identified, told me, and I am paraphrasing because this was a private conversation, that it read like someone had gone through the original and systematically removed everything interesting. Ortega herself gave a presentation at a regional conference in Reno in early 2024. Colleagues who attended described it as unusually cautious for someone who had been openly excited about her findings in informal conversations. When asked directly about the discrepancy between the preliminary findings and the published version, she declined to comment, citing ongoing institutional review. Her research funding, which had been renewed twice previously without incident, was not renewed for 2025 now. Funding lapses happen for all kinds of reasons. Institutional caution around controversial findings is not necessarily sinister. Researchers hedge their language to survive peer review. These are normal features of how science operates, imperfectly and under various pressures. But the cumulative pattern is difficult to ignore. A significant discovery, a published account that omits the most significant details, a researcher who goes quiet, funding that disappears, dive access to the specific survey area restricted under a permitting review that has been, as of this recording, ongoing for over a year. Something is being managed here. Whether that management is driven by genuine scientific caution, by bureaucratic inertia, by institutional embarrassment at the implications of the findings, or by something more deliberate, I cannot tell you with certainty. What I can tell you is that the findings themselves are documented, the pattern of their suppression is documented, and the gap between the two deserves more scrutiny than it has received. What this actually means. Step back for a moment from the specific details of the dive, the formations, the bones, the dating, the institutional shuffle. Step back and look at what this discovery, if it holds up under the scrutiny it deserves, actually implies. We have built an entire framework for understanding early human presence in North America around a set of assumptions that have been challenged repeatedly over the past 30 years and that continue to crack under new evidence. The Clovis first model, the idea that the first Americans arrived via land bridge approximately 13,000 years ago and spread rapidly southward, has been contradicted by archaeological sites across the continent showing human presence that predates it. Sites in Chile, sites in Oregon, sites in Texas, each one nudging the timeline backward and complicating the picture. Lake Tahoe adds another piece to a puzzle that is becoming increasingly difficult to force into the old frame. If human beings were present on the shores of Lake Tahoe 10,000 to 12,000 years ago, and if they were capable of the organized construction implied by the formations found by Ortega's team, then we are not talking about the sparse nomadic populations that conventional models describe. We are talking about a group with the organizational capacity to plan, labor, and build in stone. A group sophisticated enough to select, modify, and position multi-ton rocks in deliberate arrangements. That is not primitive. That is not early. That is a level of social organization and technical capability that our standard story of early North American habitation does not have room for. And here's the part that genuinely keeps freshwater geologists and paleoarchaeologists awake at night. Lake Tahoe is not the only high-altitude western lake sitting on a geologically active fault system with a dramatically fluctuating water history and minimal systematic deep survey work. Deep. It is one of dozens. Most of them have never been systematically examined. Most of their lake beds have never been seen by human eyes in recorded history. What else is down there? What other structures, other evidence, other remnants of human activity from periods we have not adequately accounted for are sitting in cold, dark water waiting for a drought, a water level drop, or a determined dive team to bring them into the light? We have surveyed less than 20% of Earth's freshwater lake floors with any scientific rigor. 20%. For a planet that is supposedly known and mapped and understood. The honest answer to what the Lake Tahoe discovery means is that we do not yet know. And the more honest answer beneath that one is that we have not been asking the right questions, in the right places, with the right tools, for long enough to even know what we do not know. The truth they left in the water. Jeremy Wade once sat on the bank of a dead river in the Amazon and wept, not because of what he had found, but because of what he had failed to say while he had the platform to say it. I think about that image a lot when I am putting together stories like this one, because here is the thing about Lake Tahoe that I keep coming back to. The lake is still dropping. As of this recording, the water level remains below historical averages. The drought conditions that accelerated the decline have not fully reversed. Climate modeling for the Sierra Nevada suggests that the wet years that historically recharge the Tahoe Basin will become less frequent and less reliable as global temperatures continue to rise, which means the lake will continue to expose margins, continue to reveal what has been hidden in its depths, continue to offer, for anyone willing to look carefully and honestly, a record of what came before us and what we have not adequately accounted for. That record is fragile. The same receding water that reveals submerged structures also exposes them to erosion, to disturbance, to the kind of incremental destruction that happens when sensitive archaeological features meet air, sunlight, and fluctuating water margins. The window to study what the lake is showing us is not permanent. It may not even be long. And yet the official response has been, broadly speaking, to permit access reviews, to publish hedged versions of significant findings, to allow funding gaps to go quietly unfilled. I am not naive about why this happens. The implications of what Ortega's team found are genuinely destabilizing to established frameworks. Archaeology, like every academic discipline, has institutional inertia. Careers are built on consensus. Funding flows toward confirmation of existing models. Evidence that requires the whole map to be redrawn tends to be received not with excitement, but with resistance, even when the evidence is solid, even when the measurements are real, even when the bones are right there in the cold, dark water. But the evidence does not care about institutional comfort. The stones do not become less rectilinear because acknowledging them is professionally inconvenient. The paleo shoreline does not shift to a more acceptable date because the implications of the real date are uncomfortable. What was found at the bottom of Lake Tahoe when the water dropped is not a curiosity. It is not a footnote. It is a signal, one of many signals accumulating from sites around the world, that the story we have told ourselves about human history in the Americas is incomplete in ways we are only beginning to understand. The people who arranged those stones, whoever they were, however long ago they stood on that shore and looked out at a lake that was hundreds of feet shallower than it is today, they left something behind, or it is not intentionally, probably. They were not thinking about us. They were just building what they needed to build, living how they needed to live in a landscape that has since been swallowed by rising water and lost time, but we found it anyway, or rather the lake chose this moment, this drought, this particular dropping of the water to give us a look at it. The question is whether we are going to look honestly, because the truth is sitting at the bottom of Lake Tahoe right now, right at the edge of visibility, right at the depth where light starts to fail and cold starts to press in, and the easy, comfortable explanations stop being sufficient. And the water is still dropping. That is the story they have not been telling you. That is what the divers found when Lake Tahoe's water levels dropped. And now, finally, you know why the silence around it should disturb you far more than the discovery itself. This has been Uncovered Expedition. I'm Justine. Stay curious, stay skeptical, and never trust a lake that looks that beautiful.